The roads aren't bad. I wonder. If you've checked your email, you will see I sent the announcement out about the exam. Did everybody get it? Any questions about it? Listed the areas, the expectations, fears, concerns, instructions. Good luck, folks. On Friday, we were talking about the advent of the so-called Second New Deal. Remember, in 1935, Roosevelt kicks it back into gear again, and from January to August, you have the Second New Deal. And Congress, the 74th Congress, is going to pass more permanent legislation in those 8 months than any Congress in history. Now, one of the first things they did, when I can find some, one of the first things they did was begin to replace FARA with a new program. They don't exactly phase it out altogether. They bring in what's known as the WPA, the Works Projects Administration. And years later, they changed that to Works Progress Administration. But FARA had brought relief to the people that needed it, but it was obvious to everybody that people wanted a job. People really don't just want a handout. They want to work for it. They want to feel like they've earned it. They have a sense of self-worth. And Roosevelt and the New Dealers realized this. So the WPA basically created government jobs. And much like FARA, the WPA was put under Harry Hopkins. Hopkins will run so many of these relief programs, he'll get the nickname Minister of Relief. So the WPA will provide government jobs for anybody that wants one. And it could be anything from digging ditches, cleaning up in the park, to major construction works, to putting on Shakespeare in your local park. The idea behind the WPA wasn't just to put people back to work, but hopefully to put them back to work at something they were already educated or trained for. So if you're a skilled construction worker or carpenter, they're going to put you to work on construction jobs. Even if you're an artist or a musician or an actor, 3 jobs that are usually unemployed, even in the best of times. They had projects for you. They had a federal actors project, for example. There's a WPA poster advertising for one of the theater project presentations. They would put little acting troupes together, send them around the country, for example. They put artists to work painting murals in post offices, especially smaller rural ones. And a lot of them turned out to be great works of art. They put people to work on large construction projects, road building, dam building, things like that. So not only are people going back to work, they're also providing a direct benefit to society in one form or another. Good morning. talking about the second New Deal for you folks that got in here just a tad late. One of the projects, as a historian anyway, that I've always appreciated was part of the Federal Writers Project. In the 1930s, there were still Americans left that had experienced slavery. They're in their 80s and 90s, but there were still several hundred people alive in the country that had been a slave. And under the WPA, under the Federal Writers Project, they sent out historians and sociologists and people like that using a newfangled device, the tape recorder, to interview these people and get their stories. And because of that, we now have first-hand accounts from hundreds of people that had been enslaved before 1865. And I occasionally teach a course on African Americans in slavery, and the WPA narratives are priceless for students and all that to get an idea of what slavery was like. By the way, you can go online. They're under the National Archives page now, the NARA page, and type in the Federal Writers Project and slave narratives, and it'll probably take you to the site. You can read a lot of them for yourself. At its peak, it's providing paid jobs for over 3 million people. They will build 40,000 new buildings, post offices, schools, things like that, playgrounds, roads, and refurbish 85,000 existing buildings. Now, another program under the second New Deal is the REA. Remember I mentioned the alphabet agencies the other day? I told you there was a bunch of them. That's the Rural Electrification Administration. Even as late as the 1930s, 9 out of every 10 American farms did not have electricity. The electric companies complained that it wasn't feasible and it would cost too much. So you've got a large segment of America that's pretty much left out of a lot of the benefits of modern living, right? There was a cartoon in the New Yorker or something, I can't remember back then, showed a farm family with their brand new radio, and they were thrilled. And the wife says, "Isn't it wonderful?" And the husband says, "Yes, it'll even be better when we get electricity." The REA is going to set out to do what American business failed or refused to do: bring electricity to the countryside. Yeah, just set that there. I'm good. Thank you.
Did you sign?
In 1935, as I pointed out, 90% of farm families did not have electricity. Due to the REA, 15 years later, by 1950, 9 out of 10 did. So it makes a huge difference. By the way, it's also a classic example of how it's very difficult to kill some government agencies after a while. Bureaucracies take on a life of their own. And when the REA had largely completed its mission of bringing electricity to the countryside, they reinvented themselves. They got into telecommunications. So it's actually still around. It's still a government program, and it's still involved in electronics of some sort. But they kept reinventing themselves so they wouldn't lose their jobs, basically. Of course, they keep bringing, it's still a beneficial program. But. Now, another one is the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. Now, most New Deal legislation, as you probably noticed, was general in nature. It applied to the entire nation. I mean, there's some exceptions. Good morning. You know, like the AAA, that was for agriculture and all that. But most of the New Deal programs were pretty much generalized. They were for the whole nation. The TVA is one of those that's more specific. It targets a specific region of the nation for development, the Tennessee Valley, running all the way down from southern Kentucky through Tennessee down through Alabama. It was one of the poorest and most depressed regions of the nation back then. And again, part of the problem was no electricity. So the TVA, among other things, started building hydroelectric plants. Tennessee, Alabama, harnessing a lot of the natural power available. And it helps transform the Tennessee Valley. Pulls it out of the abject poverty. It also has two other benefits. One pays off big time in World War II. It produced the electricity, the immense amount of electricity needed for a government facility at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Now, what were they doing at Oak Ridge during the war? And why would that require just so much electricity? They were processing ore into enriched uranium. That's one of the places where they produced the fuel for the atomic bomb. And without the power produced by the TVA, they wouldn't have been able to do that. It takes an immense amount of electricity to do that. The other one's a little more personal. Because of the Tennessee Valley, one of the greatest recording studios ever in America got established down in Alabama, Muscle Shoals. Some of the best music of the 60s and 70s came out of that place. That won't be able to test that. Unless you're a music lover. Now, another piece of legislation passed during the Second New Deal, and this one doesn't have initials, so you're lucky. The Wagner Act. The National Labor Relations Act is its official term. It guarantees the rights of unions to organize and bargain collectively. Federal recognition of unions and the rights to bargain collectively. Now, American business, several industries, fought unionization bitterly, particularly the car industry and the steel industry. To force them to sit down at the negotiating table between 1935 and 1937, the unions launched a series of so-called sit-down strikes. And what do you do during a sit-down strike? Thank you. That's another one of those who's buried in Grant's tomb. No, in front of your workplace.
That's what I'm.
Yeah.
Wherever you work.
Yeah, if you're running a machine tool or something, you just stop working and sit down in front of it. Make sure nobody else comes in to run it. Keep the scabs out. And by the way, the companies thought they could starve the people out. The wives and other people would bundle food up together in packages and then lob them through the window to the workers so they could sustain themselves. And They had the federal right now to unionize, and neither the federal government or the state governments would break the strikes. So eventually they were forced to negotiate. The last holdout was Ford in 1940. And by the time they finally gave in, he paid the lowest wages and had the worst working conditions in the entire auto industry. Didn't always go peacefully. In May of 1937, Chicago police opened fire on unarmed and relatively peaceful strikers at the Republic Steel plant, killing 10 and wounding dozens. It's known as the Memorial Day Massacre. So there was some violence involved, unfortunately. Now, the hallmark of the Second New Deal easily is Social Security. On the 15th of August, 1935, FDR signs the Social Security Act into law. It's probably the crowning achievement of the Second New Deal. Now, it had been inspired by Francis Townsend, remember our good doctor. The law itself was written largely by Frances Perkins, the Secretary of Labor. By the way, she was a lawyer, and she specialized in labor law. She had been a big advocate in the administration for Social Security. She was a driving force. Now, benefits were far more modest than what the good doctor had proposed. Instead of $200 a month, it was only $20. And a lot of groups, unfortunately, had to be left out at first, including agricultural workers in the South, because the conservative Southerners would not vote for it if they were included. So it had to grow. It was modest at first. Now, a lot of the conservatives screamed about it being so radical. Be honest with you, it wasn't. We were the last, and I mean last, industrialized nation to enact Social Security. Far from being radical, we were on the tail end. Anybody know when and where Social Security first developed? What country was the first one to have it? The German Empire in the 1870s. They were the first to enact Social Security. You know why they picked age 65 to begin benefits? Yeah. German government did a study, found out the average German only lived till 64. So they were hedging their bets, weren't they? But everybody else had it before we did, folks. And there's still people screaming about it today. Keep in mind, remember I mentioned that one of the groups that suffered the most during the Depression was older Americans? Social Security is going to be the last major New Deal legislation. And by August of 1935, the Second New Deal had largely spent itself. And by the way, Roosevelt does get overwhelmingly reelected in 1936. Now, towards the end of the 1930s, the New Deal begins to wind down for a variety of reasons. One of them is Roosevelt overreaches himself. Congress, due to the emergency, had granted him extensive leeway in exercising presidential power. And by and large, he had acted very responsibly in using that power. But by 1937, FDR had grown extremely frustrated with a conservative Supreme Court striking down many aspects of the New Deal. The American judicial system needed reform. And in 1937, Roosevelt suggested a reform package for the judicial branch. And most of it was needed, most of it was beneficial, but Roosevelt also included in that a proposal to name up to 6 new judges to the Supreme Court. He argued that most of the justices were over 70 and they were being overworked. And you needed to add the extra judges to balance out the workload. Now, to begin with, can the President and Congress add judges to the Supreme Court? New judges? Yes? No? Can the President and Congress adjust the number of Supreme Court justices? Can they add or subtract from the number 9? Yes or no? It's an absolute, huh? No? Yes.
Take a vote on it, right?
Yeah, all the Constitution says is that Congress will establish a Supreme Court and inferior federal courts as necessary. It says nothing about how many people sit on it. In fact, under the original Supreme Court only had 6 members. They finally decided on 9 because it was uneven and you didn't have ties. But it doesn't matter. You could have 3 judges, you could have 197. That probably wouldn't be too workable, would it? So yeah, they can do it, but it's a disingenuous argument, by the way. Doesn't matter how many judges are on the court. Every judge reviews every case. So you're not lessening anybody's workload. Congress refused to go along with it. And they don't even vote on it. The so-called court packing scheme is seen as the beginning of the end of the New Deal. And by the way, despite the controversy, FDR will go on to eventually make 9 appointments to the Supreme Court, more than any president in history. But this is, in many ways, it signals the beginning of the end for the New Deal. It is not the only reason, it's not even the major reason for the end. Like many things in history, there are multiple causes. To begin with, much like the progressives before them, they begin to run out of ideas. They don't know where to go next. Remember, the progressives had largely enacted a lot of what they wanted to do, and that left them in a quandary. Where do you go next? The New Dealers are kind of in the same boat. What do you do next? We've tried everything we were thinking of. Secondly, much like World War I helps kill the progressive movement, the coming of World War II will help spell the end of the New Deal. As FDR states with the coming of World War II, Dr. New Deal must give way to Dr. Win the War. And third, when the war does kick in, much of the New Deal is no longer necessary. Now, as I pointed out earlier, the New Deal never does end the Depression. It certainly ends the crisis. It reformed the system, set a basis for recovery, but it never fully ends the Depression. The economy is still relatively sluggish in 37 and 38, early 39. What's going to kickstart the economy is the massive government spending on World War II. We're spending $500 billion fighting World War II. Now, that doesn't mean that wars are good for the economy. Ultimately, wars are horrible for economies and usually bankrupt most nations that fight too many of them. It's a historic pattern. What kickstarts the economy was the massive influx of money the government was pouring into the economy. Had the New Dealers done that with construction projects and all that, they probably would have kickstarted the economy the same way and got us out of the Depression. What I'm trying to say is they were on the right track with the pump priming. They just didn't prime the pump enough. They didn't spend enough money to get us out of the Depression. World War II will do that. Now, FDR will complete the transition to the activist presidency. Remember, I've been talking about that TR and Wilson pretty much started. FDR realized that the size and scope and complexity of the government was way beyond its current structure was able to handle. We needed a larger, more complex executive branch. And on the 8th of September, 1939, FDR issues Executive Order 8248. It creates the Executive Office of the Presidency. Creates the bureaucracy a president needs to operate in modern times. It creates the Office of Management and Budget. It creates the modern National Security Council. Creates the modern White House staff and other necessary offices.
What's the title of that one? The order,
Oh, the executive order,
executive order.
8248. Now, he issues the executive order 7 days after World War II breaks out in Europe. So by 1939, the world, which didn't learn anything from World War I, was at it again. World War I hadn't really resolved a lot, created a lot of new problems, however. There's a lot of historians, and I'm one of them, that pretty much see World War I and World War II as the same struggle with a little bit of a long peace in between. But World War I left the world in a very unstable and precarious situation. There was bitterness and resentment over the Treaty of Versailles. Both the Germans and Italians hated it. Remember, the Italians were an ally. The war had led to civil war and revolution in Russia and in China and in other places. It had contributed to the Great Depression, which was still haunting much of the industrialized world. And it contributed in general to the instability threatening the entire planet. Between 1922 and 1933, capitalizing on this discontent and desperation, highly nationalist right-wing parties take control of several major nations. Is it something I said? In 1922, the fascists under Benito Mussolini take control of Italy. They march on Rome and force the king to make Mussolini the prime minister, and eventually becomes dictator. By the way, his organization was known as fascist, and in a general sense, the Nazis and Japanese militarists were also fascist. Anybody know where the term fascist came from? Well, you're close. It isn't Greek, it's Roman. No, you're close. You're at least in the Mediterranean.
That's where they are.
It's where I'd like to be right now. Southern coast of Italy. Never mind. The Roman Empire, one of their symbols was the so-called fasci. It was a symbol of power. It showed a sword and a stalk of wheat, emphasizing their strength agriculturally and militarily. Mussolini, he had visions of reinvigorating the old Roman Empire. So he called his political party fascist, which in essence means power. That's from the old Roman fasci, their symbol of power.
Yeah, but this one,
I wouldn't say an obsession with Caesar, but he had this dream of recreating the old Roman Empire. And quite frankly, Italy in the 1930s wasn't Rome in the 2nd century BC. They weren't going to do it. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, the Japanese militarists, launching a campaign of assassination, eventually eliminate most of their rivals and dominate the Japanese government. They turn it, in essence, into a military dictatorship. And in January of 1933, the fascist of all fascists, Adolf Hitler, becomes Chancellor of Germany. It's one of the great ironies of World War II that two of the greatest leaders, FDR and Hitler, both come to power in early 1933. By the way, Hitler actually initially comes to power legally in Germany. He's appointed chancellor by the president, Hindenburg. And then Hindenburg dies and Hitler seizes full power. All of these fascist states are virulently nationalistic, militaristic, racist, and expansionistic. How's that for an agenda? The Germans, for example, believe that everybody except Germans are Untermenschen, particularly Jews and Slavs. Anybody speak German? What's Untermenschen? Inferior peoples. Yes, if you're not, German, you're inferior. By the way, the Japanese had a similar view. They were part of the Yamato nation. They were gods. Didn't you know that? The rest of us are mere mortals. The Japanese people were infused with kami, sacredness. That's why it was perfectly all right for them to abuse everybody else. Germans had a similar view. The Germans wanted Lebensraum, living space. And they were quite willing to exterminate their neighbors to take it. Give you some idea what fascism was like? All three of these nations, to some degree or another, believe they are superior and destined for greatness. Yeah, they bring on the greatest catastrophe ever to hit this world. And here's arguably one of the all-time worst human beings ever to take a breath. He was a World War I veteran, and I've always been just a little upset that some British or French sniper didn't get his ass during World War I. A bullet right between his eyes, I'd be lecturing on something else today. Hopefully something happier. But unfortunately, he survived. 9 million combatants get killed in the war, and that guy lives. This really ain't fair. And here they are. By the way, originally Hitler kind of looked up to Mussolini because Mussolini was the first. He was sort of the model. And then after Hitler got to know Mussolini, it kind of went the other way. He became Hitler's stooge. All three of these fascist powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, begin to expand at the expense of their neighbors in the 1930s. Italy conquers Albania, and then to try and revive Italian colonialism in Africa, attacks Ethiopia. Germany absorbs Austria, the Sudetenland, which was part of Czechoslovakia, and then eventually much of Czechoslovakia. Here we go. Here's Germany. And these areas here are the areas they seized before World War II breaks out. By the way, Hitler wasn't even German, he was Austrian. He'd been born in Austria. And Japan seizes Manchuria from China. They had already seized Korea and made that a colony. And then they will attack northern China. In fact, if you really want to be technical, World War II doesn't begin with the invasion of Poland by Germany in 1939. You could argue it actually begins in 1931 with the Japanese invasion of China. Because eventually both wars merge into what we call World War II. So you've got these fascist states running wild. What are the Western powers doing about this?
No.
Actually, they're doing something.
What do you have? I know at this point, Britain.
No, you are essentially correct. The only thing they're doing is sending them strongly worded diplomatic protests.
Oh, is it?
Yeah,
Just words?
yeah, just words.
Maybe blue?
Not even the threat of bullets. So yeah, you were right, they really aren't doing anything. Yeah, Hitler lost sleep at night because Britain launched a diplomatic protest. Western reaction to fascist aggression was somewhat half-hearted and largely confined to diplomatic protest. If you're one of these aggressive fascist powers, what conclusion do you reach about the Western powers?
Lazy, not willing to act, obviously, I forget what the term is,
Appeasement. Is that the term you're looking for?
I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, they're unwilling to act. If you're one of these fascist powers, you come to the conclusion that you can do whatever you want. They don't have the guts to confront you over it. Now keep in mind, World War I had been devastating to Europe. Britain, and especially France, wanted nothing to do with another world war. Damn near every family in those countries had somebody killed. France, in particular, did have a rather defeatist attitude. In many ways, they had borne the brunt of World War I. A lot of it had been fought on their soil. So the Western powers really lacked the heart to provoke another world war. The United States didn't suffer like that during World War I. A lot of Americans regretted our involvement, especially when the Treaty of Versailles did not turn out to be the idealistic peace it was supposed to be. So we had kind of crawled back into our isolationist shell. And by the way, that doesn't work anymore, as we will discover. The world's a much smaller place. It's a much smaller place now today than it was in the 1930s. You cannot, especially if you're a great power, isolate yourself from world events. We will try like hell, but eventually we will get drawn into this. It's not realistic. So we're isolationist, France is defeatist, and everybody's reluctant to provoke another world war. Now, Congress was afraid that FDR might want to interfere down the road. So between 1935 and 1937, reflecting this hardcore isolationist sentiment, Congress passes a series of laws known as the Neutrality Acts. And they're aimed at what? Yeah, keeping us neutral. They were aimed largely at the causes that had brought us into World War I. So they're trying to prevent us from getting into another World War I in many ways. To begin with, it prohibited monetary loans or arms sales or shipments to any belligerent power. Once the president recognizes a state of war exists between two other countries, we can no longer sell them arms or ammunition, can't ship them anything like that, and we can't lend them money. Remember, that was one of the things that brought us into World War I. Our economic ties to the Allies. Secondly, Americans were prohibited from traveling on foreign passenger ships during time of war. If a country's at war, you can't travel on their ships. And what's that designed to try and prevent? Very good, thank you. Yeah, remember the Lusitania, 128 Americans killed on that. There will be no Lusitanias under the Neutrality Acts. And by the way, there's no way the government's going to stop you from getting on one of these ships. The thing is, if it gets sunk, you're on your own. The U.S. government's not, going to go to war over that because you were expressly told you weren't supposed to do it. And Americans were prohibited from serving in foreign militaries. Again, if you recall from World War I, before we ever declared war, tens of thousands of Americans are already fighting in it. So it prohibits Americans from fighting in foreign wars, unless they're fighting for the United States. So you can't go over and, sign up and fight for the British this time, or the French, or whatever. Can't be a mercenary. Roosevelt is leery about these changes in the world, and he personally believes that fascism is a serious and growing threat, and he was right. But he also realizes that both Congress and the American public support isolationism. And quite frankly, he doesn't want war either. So he stresses his commitment to peace and keeping the U.S. neutral. In a campaign speech in August of 1936, Roosevelt told his audience, "I have seen war. I have seen blood running from the wounded. I have seen men coughing out their gassed lungs. I have seen the agony of mothers and wives. I hate war." And by the way, he had seen all of that. It was on a 2-week fact-finding tour towards the end of World War I. Remember, he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Wilson sent him over there as the head of a fact-finding delegation. And he did spend a lot of time in the trenches and military hospitals. So he did see that, he just didn't experience it himself. He never said he did. So even Roosevelt, at least in 1936, commits himself to isolationism. Now, in July of that year, the Spanish Civil War begins. Spanish fascists, and by the way, they call themselves phalangists. You don't have to remember that. That was their nickname. Under a Spanish general, Francisco Franco, launched a rebellion against the duly elected government of Spain. So you have the fascists, the phalangists, and by the way, they're usually called the nationalists. So when I refer to the nationalists, I mean Franco's people. You have the nationalists under Franco versus the Republicans, the duly elected government of Spain. Franco gets a lot of support from both Mussolini and Hitler, especially in the form of air power, artillery, and armor. Germans send a small force to support Franco in the war. They call it the Condor Legion. And both Italy and Germany use the Spanish Civil War to work out tactics they're going to use in World War II. So you got the two fascist powers in Europe actively supporting Franco. Who's supporting the elected government of Spain? Are we? No. The only nation that sends aid is communist Russia under Stalin. And obviously, he's not doing that for any love of elected government, is he? He's a filthy dictator himself. So why is he helping a freely elected government? Why is he willing to help the Spanish government over the fascists? Not necessarily. Good guess, though, you're thinking. That's what I'm trying to get you guys to do. Why would you support Spain?
They must have something.
No.
Because they don't like the Germans.
There you go. He's already suspicious of Hitler. Fascism is an ultra-right-wing ideology. Communism is an ultra-left-wing ideology. And by the way, they preach totally different things, but if you get far enough right or left, they operate roughly the same way. They both turn into totalitarian dictatorships. So they're enemies on a couple of levels, especially ideological. And by the way, the Soviet Union only supplies enough help to Spain to tie the Germans enough for the Spanish government to win. So even the aid they give isn't all that much.
What year was that? What year was it? July?
That was 1936, yeah.
July 1936.
Mm-hmm. Now, FDR does invoke the Neutrality Acts, but that doesn't stop thousands of Americans from volunteering to fight for Republican Spain anyway. They will defy American law to do it. Most of them fight in an American unit known as the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. About 3,000 Americans will fight it. And by the way, to show you a couple of things, one, don't be fooled by titles. The Abraham Lincoln Brigade was funded and put together by the Communist Party USA. So it's a communist front. Secondly, about 98% of the people that fought in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade were not communist. And a lot of them knew the communists were funding it, but it was a vehicle for them to get to Spain to fight for the Republican government. So keep that in mind. Even though the communists put it together, most of the people fighting in it were not communists by any means. When many of them got home, they were initially prosecuted under the Neutrality Acts. But interestingly, when World War II breaks out and we're officially at war with the Nazis, they become heroes. You ever read an Ernest Hemingway novel, For Whom the Bell Tolls? You folks got to read some great literature someday. Yeah. It's all about...
Is that a Metallica song?
Actually, I think it is too, yeah.
It is.
But I don't think it's related to the book. Another metalhead over there, huh?
I mean, it is like
Yeah, I grew up with Black Sabbath and Deep Purple. I've been into heavy metal since I've been born.
that.
But anyway, that's not what you guys are here. But anyway, Hemingway wrote about it in 1943. During World War II, they made it into a movie starring Gary Cooper. And by that point, All these guys that had fought for Republic in Spain were now seen as heroes. Let me finish up with one thing and let you out of here. In November of that year, Italy and Germany signed a former military alliance. And eventually, Japan joins it. When they signed it, Mussolini bragged that Europe now revolved on a Rome to Berlin axis. And that's how the bad guys in World War II get their name. That's how they become known as the Axis powers. Well, that's a later incarnation of it, yeah. And I'll see you guys on Wednesday.